Good evening and welcome to Inside the Rookery, Season 6, Episode something. Um, 7 or 8, I can't remember. Usually I have it written down, but we went live quite quickly and my note is in the other room, so it will remain a mystery until you see the title on YouTube afterwards, what this is. So we welcome today Jendia. No, that is the first time I've said that out loud, so I just want to check that I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Perfect.
Excellent, Jendia Gammon, who we interviewed all the way back in season 4, episode 18, I think, when you were writing under the pen name J. Diane Dotson. So
Right.
back then we talked about this book, which is published under that pen name, The Shadow Galaxy, which I absolutely love. And maybe if we have a little bit of time today, we'll talk just a teeny bit about that because I've got some questions.
Oh yes, I would love that.
Excellent.
I've got some intriguing news related to it. So
Oh, brilliant. Well, I can't wait because I absolutely love it. We had Gareth on a month or so after you came on, and I took some time in his stream to just gush about your book. So I'm sure he loved that.
thank you.
But yeah, welcome back. What's been going on since we last spoke to you?
So the brand new release that we'll talk about today is out as of this week, The Inn at the Amethyst Lantern, which is my young adult novel debut. And it's sci-fi fantasy with a bit of horror, an adventure story that is set in the future. And it is a lunar punk genre, which is sort of a subgenre of SFF. So that just came out this 24th of October. And I had a big book launch at Mysterious Galaxy in San Diego, which was awesome. I had a cake with a lighthouse on it because the Amethyst Lantern is the lighthouse. And there's been a lot. So I went on submission with a dragon fantasy with my agent. That's my first book that's ever gone on sub. And that was on submission for 10 months and we pulled it. So bummed about that, but I got so much good feedback. Everybody loved it, but it was either too YA or not YA enough, which kind of killed me. So, but everybody loved it. And several of the editors, some of whom are Big Five, wanted to see more of my work. So related to that, we can talk about the Shadow Galaxy and a particular story in there that is connected to my latest book on submission, which is a thriller with sci-fi and horror elements. My first sort of more mainstream, but it is definitely still genre. And that has just gone on submission 2 weeks ago. So we're very hopeful and excited. And I'm currently writing a campy horror novel set in Southern California that is full of a lot of savage wit and gore. And it's just a lot of fun, super campy. And I'm having fun with it. So I've done a lot of things with my agent. We just had a call yesterday. And we decided what my next book after that campy horror is going to be. And in the new year, I will be writing something very hot in science fiction, sexy, sexy sci-fi coming your way. So that's going to be tons of fun. And that will be for adults as well. So yeah, I've been busy. So that's just some of what's going on. I've been told that this is now Android Press's best-selling book. So that's pretty awesome. And it's just been out this week. So I've got two great reviews in the last couple of days, one of which said that it was like if Goonies was crossed with Pitch Black. And I'm like, nailed it. That's it. That's it. You know, sort of like the Stranger Things sort of vibe. So it's been busy. It's been super busy. And it was a tough year because I lost my mother in February and the day after my birthday. And it was just, that's kind of had the effect of everything getting pushed in a different direction or pushed back or tabled. But you know, I'm kind of in a better space now and like missing my parents, wanting to honor them. They're both like directly responsible for my being a writer. And also Gareth and I are making a publishing imprint for science fiction, fantasy, horror, and mystery.
That
It's a
is
lot.
exciting and brilliant news.
Yeah.
Congratulations
Thank you.
on everything, but specifically on the great reviews and it already being the top selling book. That's brilliant. And we've put your links in the chat. I've brought them up on the screen. But as always, please pop comments and questions into the comments. I'll bring them up. We've got plenty of pre-submitted questions, but we do always like to hear from our viewers who watch us live.
Great.
Quick
Thank
question.
you for having me. I'm so glad to be back.
Dead hot sunlight, hot city light.
Ooh, well, so it's a galactic story, so there will be some hot suns, but I'm talking hot love.
Adult. Yeah.
Definite adult sci-fi romp. And it will incorporate some characters from several of the short stories I've written. And I have short stories now under Jendia Gammon in Interzone and in anthologies out now. 2 of them are out now. One is coming in 2024. That's a Cyber Salon anthology. So you can now see all my works under the link under books for both names. Everything will be Jendia Gammon going forward, just so you know. That's my name. Jennifer Diane Gammon is my born name. So.
And Seagoat says, a new imprint, you'll need to keep us all informed. Yep.
Yes, so we made the announcement earlier this year. And during that time, what has happened is that I've done a lot of research. We had my web guys make a website that is not officially launched yet. So we had filed to form a production company in Los Angeles, and the publishing imprint is an offshoot of that company. So we decided to go ahead and build the logos in the website for the publishing imprint first before we did anything else related to the company. So all of that will be debuted in 2024. The logos are awesome. The name of it is awesome. And so we will do a big reveal of all of that. Unfortunately, I can't do that now. Don't send us your queries. Don't send anything to us. Okay. But it's going to be great. And it's going to be adult, young adult, middle grade. And it will be novels, novellas, novelettes, graphic novels. So we want to do all that. We want to take our time, do it right. I'm researching contracts. I'm talking to agents and publishers about how they do things, what they want to see. And we want to make sure we're taking really great care of our authors. We want to promote them really well. You know, Gareth has a marketing background and I have sort of like a, journalism background. So we have a way of promoting people that we want to showcase our authors and make them feel proud to be part of it, because we would be proud of them. So
that's really exciting. And we will not ask you any more questions on that now, but we will come back when you can tell us more and have another.
Can't wait.
So let's just jump into that. You said going forwards, it's Jendia Gammon, and essentially, Jenna, you've answered the first half of that question. The second half, sorry, can you talk us through your new pen name? But why do authors use pen names? Let's just go to that question instead.
Yeah, this is a very common thing. And oftentimes, authors will use wildly different pen names because they're writing in wildly different genres and they don't want confusion for their audiences. This can definitely come into play if you're writing like kids' picture books on one name and something really spicy and adult. You don't really want, you know what I mean? So that's a choice. And also just different genres. I know one author who writes historic romance under one pen name. She writes sort of magical realism, but cozy stuff under another. And then her third is hard sci-fi. There is no crossover there at all with her. And so and then the same thing with John Courtney Grimwood. Like he's got 3, he writes thrillers, he writes, genre. So it's often that kind of thing. Some people want anonymity, right? They don't want anybody to know their name. So they pick a pen name from go. And I decided, now that my parents are gone and, I'm a Gammon and from East Tennessee, there's a lot of us there and throughout America. And so I wanted to honor my family. This was actually an old pen name I was going to use a long time ago. And Jendia was a nickname of mine. And it's interesting, when Gareth and I had gone to Tennessee for my mom's post memorial in June, we were on our way back, and a friend of mine who used to call me Jendia all the time, we found out, like, as we were heading back through Arizona, we found out that, like, right when we were headed through there, that he had passed away at that time. And I was like, right as I decided to use Jendia, and it was really uncanny and weird, but I felt like that's another way to honor a friend and my family, right? So, but it just was a fun and unique name, and also good for search engine optimization, SEO. And it's a unique name, right? You're not going to find very many Jendia Gammons out there, probably no others, but
I've never encountered
it's different.
I've never encountered a Jendia, but also Gammon in the UK isn't a common surname. It wasn't one that I had encountered before, so that's quite unique as well.
Irish. It was an Irish surname. Yep. So I have a lot of Irish ancestry, and that's where that comes from. So, and I know that I was cautioned that because of, the last 10 years, that gammon as a word had taken on a different meaning in the UK, which none of us in America knows or cares.
Yeah.
But I was cautioned against it. And I was like, look, I would rather appeal to 8 billion readers than to try to worry about, like, maybe it's time somebody made this name good, that it stood for something good. I will be that person. I will try to honor my family and try to be a good person, because I'm a big tent individual, and so that's where I'm at with that. I do realize the connotation that the name has, but most of the world doesn't care.
No, and even in the UK, no one's gonna assume that because that's your name that you're writing under, that's the political views that you're kind of representing. So,
well, yeah, because if they did, they sure don't know me.
No,
I'm the opposite of that. So yeah. So those are some reasons. And, even Gareth has talked about, if he were to write under a very different genre, he might switch up his name a little bit. So this is very common to do pen names, and it's kind of fun. There's kind of like in my case, they're close to my actual name, right? But some people just completely, I have one of my brothers writes, he's not published yet, but his pen name is so completely different from his actual name, but it's something fun for him. He sort of borrows, from a poet and from, the West Coast of the US. So I thought that was pretty cool. You can come up with anything you want, but you do have to file, with, in our case, like you have to file through a court to get a fictitious name. So
yeah, that makes sense.
It's not just something you just do out of thin air in the US. You have to file it somewhere.
So let's talk about young adult fiction. Maybe Seago asked, when we say young adult fiction, what are we including in our stories and what are we leaving out to define as young adult?
Young adult refers to fiction which is centered around basically teenagers. In this case, it's considered 13 to 18. It's not 20-something people masquerading as teens, like on Riverdale or something. But it's often misconstrued. It isn't middle grade, which is, 12, like 8 to 12-year-olds, like in this case, it's true teen fiction. These protagonists are teens and the content is acceptable for that age range. Whereas you could have a protagonist like in Firestarter by Stephen King, who is a kid, but that is not something that, kids should technically read. Although of course I did, as we all sneaked our little copies of Stephen King and others when back in the 80s. So, in this case, that is what young adult fiction is. It's in that age group. And I'm hoping that this will appeal to several age groups. But if it were a movie, I'd call it PG-13.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. And Seago, then follow up with regards to the Inn at the Amethyst Lantern. Is it part of a series or a standalone book? What's the plan? Okay.
It's standalone right now, but we'll see.
If Andy Law was here, he'd be super excited that it has a lighthouse on the cover because he was a lighthouse kid. He grew up in a lighthouse.
Oh my God, I forgot that. Oh my God. Yeah. We got to talk.
His mum and dad were lighthouse keepers. So how central is the light? I presume it's pretty central. It's right there on the cover.
Right. The Amethyst Lantern is the name of the lighthouse, and it is an ancient lighthouse with a secret history. And this story takes place 500 years in the future after a post-climate apocalypse, and everybody has adapted to night living because it's too harsh to be out during the day. And it's not just one disaster that has happened. In 500 years, a lot of bad things go down, not just climate, but also natural disasters like volcanoes, war, things like this, so there's a lot of, how like Mad Max kind of centered, post-nuke. So there's a hints of some really bad stuff happen, more pandemics, and so this is in the future, but this lighthouse is still standing after all that time. And the significance of it is that it's connected to an inn that is in the base of it, that is a derelict inn that has been shuttered for God knows how long. And suddenly Genshin Lightworth, the main character who's 14, she gets an invitation from someone at the inn, delivered via 2 giant Luna moths to her. So things get very strange very fast.
I can just, some of the descriptions there do for me call back to the Shadow Galaxy. Some of that kind of, and I don't know, I think you said that maybe one of the short stories in there is connected to,
not to this book, but to
not to
something
that
else.
book, to another book. Yeah,
But we can talk about what that is later.
Yeah, but the themes, the being called upon from the past, and the past echoing into the future. There's a few in the Shadow Galaxy that have that feeling and that theme.
Yeah, that seems to be kind of on brand for me, because the Questerzon saga, which I self-published under J. Diane Dotson, which is, by the way, one of the main reasons I wanted to switch to Jendia Gammon, not just because of family, but because I'm moving into traditional publishing. And I kind of wanted to separate that out because I was an indie author under J. Diane Dotson. And it's just a very different set of themes that I'm writing in now. There is some bleed through, but there are some differences. But in the Questerzon saga, time and the manipulation of reality kind of comes into play. Not time travel per se, but there are messages from someone threaded throughout the books to try to help guide our heroine Gala, and she doesn't know for decades who that is or what it is, but there's this sort of, I'm playing with that sort of, there's an other realm situation or an other time, and messages from strange beings. So I love stuff like that. I just love it.
And in the Shadow Galaxy, we talked last time you came on about Appalachia. That's the right way to say it?
Yeah, thank you.
We talked a lot about you growing up there, and how I felt when I read it after that, I felt a very, well, we talked also about the Highlands of Scotland and the similarities of the two areas in terms of the people who had moved over, but also the folklore and the isolation of it. But when I read the Shadow Galaxy, honestly, I could not. I just kept on turning to Andy Law and saying to him, like, I wish I had written this in the Scotland version, because it really spoke to me as a woman, quite specifically, and a mother, but as a woman through my life, being a teenager and the possibilities, and then growing up and becoming a woman, becoming a mother. Is that purposeful? Do you feel like that about the book? Have other people given you that feedback, that it really speaks to a woman's experience? Maybe a particularly geeky, nerdy, sci-fi, fantasy obsessed woman, but a woman.
Yeah. It's interesting. You're one of the few people who's made that connection, and I find that really interesting. The editor is a woman, and she responded powerfully to that, although she's not a mother. And I feel like parents and caregivers respond to some of the stories in there, because there's a pull of, wanting to help someone who's hurting, whether or not they're a child or, an adult who is a parent themselves, because I play with that several times, going either on the child side or the parent side, the guardian side, grandparent side a little bit, in one evening in Fogville. So I would say that at this point, it's going to be hard for me to untangle that from my writing, but I have done with some of the things I'm writing right now. I've stepped out a little bit to be in a situation where the protagonist there is no maternal, either the mother is missing, or this person is just not dealing with that aspect at all. So that's kind of an interesting.
I think it was, what I found particularly powerful and remarkable about it was that all the way through, I was comparing it to other books and short stories and anthologies that I had read, which had women protagonists, and they didn't feel like that's really what the person would have done. And you just nailed exactly in every single one. I was like, yeah, that's satisfying. It is sad sometimes, it's heartbreaking, it's joyful, but it always felt like true to the characters that you were writing. I've told so many people about it because I think it's amazing.
Thank you.
I think you're amazing.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to reading the next one.
So the story Rotor in the Shadow Galaxy, I think, too, ties into all that. How you start out that Roan is a woman who finds a robot and you know, an ancient robot in a barn, wakes him up, and she falls in love with him. And then the time that passes and she becomes a mother, and you know, she's trying to find him after he's been taken away. So it's just playing with that sort of weird sort of guilt of being like, you know, I'm still pursuing this thing, even though I'm a mother and I need to be responsible for my kids. You know, this part of is still hooked into my soul. So there was something about that in there. And then, yeah, it's interesting. Like, I'm wondering how many people wrote her particularly that story affects.
Oh,
because
yes. That's one of the ones in particular that I find really powerful.
yeah. So
Yeah. The idea of the kind of allegory, the analogy of keeping a bit of yourself when society expects you to be all of these words that ultimately aren't you. And, you know, that applies to everyone, whether you're a father, a mother, a wife, a husband, you know, a lawyer, a doctor. Yeah.
One thing that's really interesting now that you've said that is that I'm noticing that the things that I have written this year have been strongly because I've lost my parents, strongly from the daughter perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm coming from another angle. Now they're gone, and it's a very different feeling of, you know, thinking in terms of that, where, you know, so I've got a bit of both going on with my stories that I'm currently writing and that are published, you know. So it's bittersweet that I feel like it's healthy to explore those things that are important to you and those dynamics that maybe get erased in genre fiction somewhat.
So in Lazy Cat asks, you describe your work as lunar punk. What does that mean in terms of the genre? And how useful do you find being quite specific about genre?
So I have a fun story about how this came to be. Solar Punk magazine, and the editor-in-chief is Justine Thornton Kurtzen, I think. I can't remember how to pronounce her last name. But she runs this fascinating sort of sustainable future publication. And there was a call for an anthology for lunar punk, which was flipping solar punk. Solar punk related to the sun and solar energy and sustainability and aesthetics like bright greens and yellows and oranges and that sort of day, you know. And then flipping it to lunar punk, they wanted something where everything was centered around night and the moon and crystals and mushrooms and all these different aspects of bioluminescence, phosphorescence. And so I thought, oh my God, that is so for me. So I wrote a short story to submit to the anthology. They got back to me and said, we love this, but it won't fit in the anthology. And I was like, oh, bummer. But they were like, but this is our first young adult lunar punk story. So we'll publish it in the magazine. I'm like, okay, cool. You know, that's cool. So, and then as I was writing it and I was coming back from a flight from the UK, I started building out an entire universe in it. And I started sketching diagrams of what the sustainable homes would be like in a night living society. I had the lighthouse. I had all this stuff. So Midnight Serenade is the name of the short story, and you can read it on Solar Punk magazine right now. But I will say that it also makes another appearance because it is now the prologue of The Inn at the Amethyst Lantern. So you can read that story, and it centers Jen's cousin Mira. It's almost sort of like a futuristic Cinderella kind of story, but it's really a Pandora's box story, because what she doesn't realize is she's inadvertently caused a chain reaction with what she does using illicit magic. And so it's lunar punk is sort of this sort of utopian futuristic society in which everything is sort of centered around night living. Specificity of genre in this case is a lot of fun because you can really play with it. And lunar punk is kind of a newer one. And they hadn't really set out, Android Press, to have a lunar punk young adult novel. But because I came up with the idea and I said, there's this whole universe. And they said, oh, well, send us a book proposal. So I did. And they gave me the deal same day that I got the deal for Shadow Galaxy, which was crazy. And I just felt excited to be making sort of from the ground up this new universe. And because it's set 500 years in the future, there's a whole series of events that could lead to it that I've already, thought out as part of the world building. And so there's different eras called, like, before it happens, there's the golden hour where everybody's kind of realizing, okay, we're going to have to make a change. And we need to say goodbye to the old way of living, but they live it up in the golden hour. And then there's the dawn of dusk, in which they're finally transitioning over to being like, okay, let's move the society tonight to underground, whatever we need to do to survive. And then you have the full lunar punk era after that. So I dig into a lot of both fantasy and hard sci-fi mixed, and some horror into this book. So it's really fun to see now the reactions of people reading it, what they're responding to in it. And because I have a degree in ecology and evolutionary biology, I play with that a little bit, but I also have a love for astronomy and physics. And so I did seek some advice there. And Seamus Blackley, the inventor of the Xbox, is a friend of mine. And I asked him about a certain thing in this book that I won't spoil. I said, is this plausible? Because I think it sounds plausible. And he goes, yes, it is. So I thought, well, awesome. I'm on the right track on multiple levels. So I just was a perfect sort of crystallization of this new genre. And specificity of genre doesn't have to be limiting. You can really just go to town and have fun. But I do love writing across several genres. That's kind of my shtick.
It actually, just as you were describing it, it reminded me of a book that I was obsessed with. I read it quite a few times. It was a bit younger than young adult, I would say, but it was called This Time of Darkness. I can't remember who the author was, but it was an interesting, like, flipped upside down world. So and they thought the outside was, you know, gone, and as you went up through the levels, and it just struck me that was an early, without realizing it, I had read a lunar punk novel many years ago.
So that's an interesting, was it This Time of Darkness? Because that's very similar to a book I had read as a kid. And I don't know if it's the same one.
This Time of Darkness, I think it was called that. I'm just going to search.
That's the one where they had the authoritarian people underground.
Yeah, Amy and Axel. Yeah.
That's the one I read as a kid. So I was obsessed with that book. We were read that book, I think, in like 5th grade. And I had nightmares about it, but it was fascinating because I thought, here they were lied to about what was happening, you know, outside of the underground life. So that's so awesome that you brought that up, because I was just talking about it the other day.
It's brilliant. I haven't thought about that book for years, but I was completely obsessed with it for a while as well. So.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
It's a good book. Yeah, and it was one of my first exposures to that kind of sci-fi that asks questions about how society should be, you know, because they're tested and they don't read, and then some of them are special and some of them are not, but and it really it asks a lot of questions. So Seagoat says, I've read the cover notes for The Inn at the Amethyst Lantern, and I'm definitely interested in reading this. That's good to hear.
Thank you so much.
So Seagoat says, when writing fiction, do you prefer to write standalone stories, a selection of stories with a loose but common background, or a defined series of books? Or all of the above? Yeah.
All of the above, because I love writing short fiction in which I can have a small nugget of a tale and one and done, like the magical realism story that just came out in Seaside Gothic under Jendia Gammon. And you can see that under my books link. And that is A Swirl of Leaves and Sand. And it takes place in our world, but there's something otherworldly about it. So I loved that one standalone magical realism story. I have written standalone space opera short stories, like in Rhapsody of the Spheres. I have a short story called Opal World Frolic, which is, you know, this old cranky space pirate and his cranky ship have a bounty on their heads, and the fun that happens from there. And the guy's forgotten to have fun, but it's a very positive space opera story. So I love doing this sort of sampling. It's like, I love all these different genres and I love writing stories in them. So short stories are a powerful way of telling either a one and done zinger or building a collection or being part of an anthology series. I obviously had the 4-book Questrazon saga series, and that was a lifelong kind of endeavor of kind of getting finally that thing done. Not because it was hard to write, but because life, you know, got in the way. So, and then now I'm hoping, you know, I had the Dragon book on submission, and it was my hope that that would be a series. We hope that someone eventually does take it, and we'll see about everything else that I've been writing, whether or not people want a sequel.
We've just had a few readers from WorldForge. So WorldForge, World Anvil, just making up words here. So hi, Light Up the Forge. Andy's put all the links. We're talking to Jendia Gammon today about her new book. And welcome to the stream. Yep, there we go. The Inn at the Amethyst Lantern, which just came out on the 24th of October. So do check that out. Right. So this is one that we can all answer, but Andy, you can chip in as well. So Seago asks, when you read young adult fiction, what type of stories do you like to read?
Well, I like adventure stories in any genre, especially sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. I feel like, there's much has been made about sort of YA series, in which I kind of made a reference to earlier, where it's more like 20-somethings are, trying to appeal to teenage audiences or whatever. But I actually prefer when the protagonist is truly a teenager and going through this coming of age that is a powerful moment in our lives in which we're becoming who we're going to eventually be, even if that transition takes decades, still that's the sort of really interesting part of this weird cocktail of our brains changing and our bodies changing and trying to figure out where do we fit in our worlds, and whether or not they're on Earth or in space or wherever.
I always felt like when I was a teenager, everything was much more colorful and like immediate and important, to the point that my theory about the Twilight books is that they're not really about a vampire, they're just about two teenagers in love. But if you just wrote about him like he was magical and he was just a teenager, like everyone would be like, well, this is just nonsense. So she had to make him magical to truly capture like how obsessed teenagers can get and how perfect they think things are and how awful they are when things go wrong. But it is like a really magical time in the psychology of being a human, being a teenager.
There's a lot of absolutes that we feel like are certain, and they're very much not. You don't learn the subtleties until you get older and hopefully a little wiser.
Someone said, what about doing Rookery punk? We can call that crow punk.
Well, funny you should say that. I have a short story in Tales from Stolke's Hall, which is a Thrones and Bones RPG anthology by Lou Anders. So my first media tie-in book, and it's called The Tower and the Raven. And so I'm already in there. And also, if you like ravens, you're going to like this book. That's all I'm going to say.
Excellent.
So I've already done Rookery punk. Happy to do more, always. I'm a bird nerd.
How about you, Andy? What kind of young adult fiction do you read?
Well, yeah, I think like what you were saying there about the sort of sincerity of it and the sort of directness of it as well. Like I've spoken before about how I think teenagers in the press get a bad rep quite often, and as someone who like works with them all the time, like they're a constant source of inspiration, and I think that comes through in good young adult fiction, is that there's a direct engagement between younger protagonists and the whatever the big problems are that are being faced in the fiction. And I think like if you want a real world analogy, like you look at someone like Greta Thunberg, and like as a young person who has looked at it and gone, the world is on fire and the grown-ups aren't doing anything about this, so I am going to do something about this.
And that's a common theme for Gen Z right now, is to just jump in and say, why isn't anybody doing anything about this? Well, I'm going to do it. And I see that with my kids, because both of them are Gen Z. And so it's really fun to see that, taking the narrative, taking control, stepping up. And that's what happens in this book. This is very much a book about stepping up to responsibility and becoming a leader, because Jen Lightworth is not a leader. And this is a very reluctant leadership role that she was plunged in. It's not something she was born in. She was invited, but then she has to make a choice to do it or not, and step up. So it definitely leans into that sort of empowerment of, teens stepping up when there's a disaster. But she's got it pretty good until this happens.
Like I really like How We Live Now by Meg Rossoff. I don't know if you've read that one.
No, I haven't.
That's a really good. Again, it's an example. It's someone who. So I think the protagonist. I think she's about 15, and she comes over from America. She's visiting her cousins in the UK right at the point when like an apocalypse happens, basically, and kind of gets stuck over here. And again, it's that type of thing that there's she's not a natural leader, or historically hadn't been, but is kind of thrust into that and has no choice but to adapt, and through her kind of like empathy and understanding and things, that she ends up kind of being part of a better society in the kind of ashes of what's left. So
yes, I love that. Yeah, very similar vibe.
And here's a question from Lazy Cat, actually for Andy this time. So Lazy Cat says, when I was at high school, we didn't really study young adult fiction. Do you think that's changed in schools?
Definitely, definitely in sort of the what's called in Scotland. We've lost Lindsay. I'll extemporize until she comes back. I think her internet's dropped out. In Scotland, we call in the sort of the 6 years of high school, we call the first 3 years like BGE, broad general education. And in those BGE years, I think definitely there has been a move to include more kind of like YA fiction there, for like a number of different reasons. Like part of that is that, again, there's always these histrionic headlines about books being banned, which is just not actually how it works. It's just that as an English teacher, you have to choose which texts you're teaching, and some of the constraints on that are physical or financial in terms of what you can afford to kind of get in to physically teach. But some of it is to do with like questions of like representation and things like that. And occasionally you might want to teach something, like I don't think it's that controversial to suggest that maybe you want to teach the type of literature with which the young people that are reading it can maybe identify. And some of that is to do with things like kind of race, and some of that is to do with like gender and sexuality and like neurodivergence and things like that. But some of it is also just literally the age of the protagonists. If you're teaching loads of novels that are about a bunch of middle-aged people. I remember a friend of mine who is a colleague at another school taught, this is like a very niche reference that most people won't know, but there was essentially like I think it was called a prose poem, but it's called The Song of Lunch. And it was done as like a TV special with Alan Rickman and I think Emma Thompson. I think it was the two of them. And it was like it's this middle-aged couple who'd had a past and had drifted apart, and then the whole thing was just them having this conversation. And it was then released as standalone, and like she loved it, but she was in her 40s. And of course she loved it because it was a story about people in their 40s. And unsurprisingly, when she taught it to a bunch of 15-year-olds, they were not impressed. They did not engage with it at all. And that was a classic example of, it's a great book, it's of definite literary merit, it's very interesting, but there was no kind of engagement.
Not relatable.
Yeah. So I mean, like, definitely, just in terms of like things that we do teach, like a lot of schools now teach texts like Wonder, which exactly, and like it teaches a lot about empathy. There's one called The Boy at the Back of the Class. My sister lives on the mantelpiece. Like, these are all like really good young adult things that are all like, as you sort of said, like that they're all about like grappling with really big things, right? So The Boy at the Back of the Class is dealing with like immigration and how immigrants feel kind of isolated and alone. My sister Lives on the Mantelpiece is dealing with like grief and death and kind of how we can process that, but all through the all through the prism, of young adults, of teenagers, kind of living that experience. So
I suppose some of the classic books that we studied at school, actually, when you think about it, To Kill a Mockingbird, I mean, that if we define it as about the protagonist, then To Kill a Mockingbird is young adult fiction. But also some of the like classics like Wuthering Heights, Pride and Prejudice, actually those young women would have been in their teens. We think now of young women of marriageable age being in their sort of late 20s, but actually then when they were being written by women looking back at their late teenage years. So some of those are much more young adult fiction than probably, well, the casting directors ever provide us with, which is a massive bugbear of mine. TV shows, films that have teenagers and they just don't look or act or speak or do anything like teenagers.
Yeah, and like Wuthering Heights particularly, I think, is one of the most teenage novels ever written.
Oh my God, that really is. It's a favorite of mine. But I think this too is getting into shows. I think this is one reason Stranger Things took off, is because you had the spectrum of sort of starting middle grade and leading into the high school. So you had a broad range of those main characters, some of whom were a little farther along. But it was great to see them all developing either into adults or into young adults, and I also loved the cocktail of having older adults in their 40s and older being part of that conversation, which all of that dynamic happens in the Amethyst Lantern. You have the parents and the aunts, and then you have some really senior characters as well. I always love cross-generational stories. I like the representation of multiple ages in a story, because I feel like kids are not isolated. There is an influence, a sphere of influence around them, either the lack or presence of adults who influence them. So I feel like that's important to portray in books as well, not to alienate the kids from their experience of reading it, but they will probably identify with some of these older people in the story and being like, oh, well, that's my dad, that's my teacher, that, I totally get where this person's coming from, kind of deal. So
definitely. Like, I thought it was interesting. I read, I can't remember where I read it, but I read a review, maybe one that you shared on Instagram, but somebody kind of comparing it to A Wrinkle in Time.
Yes, that tripped me out. I was like, my God, that's high praise.
That really is. But from everything you've said, I can absolutely see why. Like, I can absolutely see why they're saying that. So
yeah, just trying to become a hero in an extraordinary situation that you've never seen or heard before. Your world is upended. It was a good life, and now it's under threat by somebody from our time. So a little bit of Wrath of Khan in there, but that's a fun sort of homage. But also, anybody who's reading the villains in this carefully will also pretty much figure out who else I'm skewering in the real world. Anyway, yeah, it's a lot of fun to explore those different dynamics, and I will say, don't go into this thinking that it's lingual, because this is rather more irreverent, and there's no F-bombs, but there's some swearing, because when the chips are down, and you're a teenager, you're going to swear, and so, and there's some violence and gore, and stuff like that. I put all the content warnings on StoryGraph as from the author, so that parents can go and read it, or caregivers can go and read it. But, I think that if you're 13 or over, go for it. If you're younger than that, I would caution, but no judgment. It's a guardian's decision, and goodness knows, I read and saw things much more mature than this when I was young, but it's one of those things that I did want to kind of put out there, that if it were a movie, it'd be PG-13. So.
And just on the note about movies and studios, Seago asks, in today's world, a lot of fiction is picked up by studios, movie or TV. Do you have this in your mind as you write? Would you like to see a film adaptation be done on your books? If so, which?
Well, I don't know anybody who'd be like, oh, please, God, no, don't film my book. Please don't give me that giant check. But there might be some people who don't want it. Well, actually, there is somebody.
I mean, Alan Moore. But Alan Moore. Yeah.
No, actually, Robin McKinley, who wrote The Hero on the Crown, which is one of my favorite books, which is now considered YA fantasy. That protagonist, Erin, was 18. She was pretty adamantly not wanting that adapted, and I get it. So, but in this case, I don't write with that intention, but here's the way I do write. I write cinematically. I'm a very visual person. I'm an artist. So I'm thinking in terms of how everything is looking. So when I have a description of a scene, that when I think of a book, it's hard to describe. This isn't typical. A lot of people outline, I see it as a movie. It's in my head. And the only thing to do is to get it on the page.
Mm-hmm.
So I've already got it all there. The visuals, the scenes, the drama, everything is there. And that's just how I write. But it's not with the intention to be filmed. It's just that I write cinematically. And I remember somebody saying that the final climax of the Questrazon saga, they said that it would need a huge budget because it was so cinematic that, that it was just all these different pieces happening at the same time that were crazy. So that's just how I write, and I've not ever written a screenplay except for a fun fake one of Frasier, but just for fun. But that is something that I do live in Los Angeles. So it would be fun to help write a screenplay for this. And I think that of everything I've written and will be writing, this one is probably a pretty likely candidate for especially a show. But the other one, the campy horror one that I'm writing right now, that's set in Southern California, screams movie or show. So it's just how I roll. I don't know. I mean, I wish, somebody could take my back catalog, that they would grab this, because I'm broke. I'm a writer. I don't want to say no, but I do want to be involved on some level, because I would love to have creative control as a producer of anything that got adapted, because I know the visuals. I have the artwork that I've done myself, the concept art. I've kind of also commissioned artists to make art in these worlds. So I know exactly how it should look and feel, the vibe, the kind of character actors that need to play the roles and things like that.
I think we talked a little bit about this when you were last on, and part of the reason you felt you were so visual and you saw it like that was because you started as a young person creating worlds. So you created your own worlds, and then once you've created your own worlds, you just write stories that are happening in those worlds. And that's something Andy Leask and we talked about a lot when we were writing Wifrip 4th edition, that because we'd been playing a campaign, multiple campaigns in that world for 10, 15 years, a lot of the words that we were giving to Andy Law for him to edit were literally just us writing down memories of places we'd been or people we'd met. And it was a unique experience like nothing else, because for me it was like almost in a way Wifrip 4th edition is our memoirs of our time in the Warhammer world. So I really strongly connect with that, the idea that it's in there and you're then the story itself is playing out in the world that exists in your mind.
Right.
Seagoat says, based on the cover notes, I would watch a film of the Inn at the Amethyst Lantern.
Thank you. I think it would probably be a better show than a movie, but we'll see. Just because
like Shadow and Bone, have you seen?
I'm aware of it, but I haven't read or seen it. I do know about it.
Yeah, it's very different in tone, but I encountered that first as the TV show, and then one of my daughters loved it so much that she then went out and got all the special editions of the books, and
they're beautiful ones.
Yeah, oh, they're lovely. They're really lovely.
I'd love it if somebody. I mean, I'm obsessed with this cover by Kim Herbst. I had worked with this artist in the past, and I was like, it's got to be her. And they were like, okay. I'm like, oh, thank God. But I would like somebody though to give like the special edition with the special edges and be part of like Owl Crate or Loot Crate, because it just, there's so many gorgeously made books, and I'd love to see that. But if it were a show, I've seen how masterful his Dark Materials was given the treatment by HBO Max, whatever, and BBC. God, if I could get that crew and make a show with this, because they nailed it. They absolutely killed it. And I couldn't believe it. Like finally somebody understood what Philip Pullman was trying to do. And the casting, the effects, just absolutely flawless. So I would love it if it were a show, but if it's a movie, I'm not going to be too upset either. It's just that there's so much in that world that you would miss a lot of it. You would want to pause a little more, because when you're in this world, everybody who's read it says the same thing, that they just want to be in it, that it's just so immersive and fantastical and beautiful. I try to make it as beautiful and full of detail as possible. You just don't want to leave. A little bit of that is like a splash of The Secret of Nim. Like the whole, the vibe of that movie regarding the rose bush, I kind of was like, ooh, I like the feeling I have when they're in that rose bush, like down with the lantern dropping down into the water and, all this beautiful twinkling lights and mushrooms. I was like, that's what I want, I wanted all the beautiful sort of things that I love at night. So it just was, I hope somebody takes it and does exactly what I see in my head with it. I have a lot of notes to give and a lot of sketches of my own. So
I'd be really excited to see that. It's interesting that you talk about his Dark Materials, because what I think, I've seen the film, I've seen the TV series, and the TV series, the contrast between his imagining of Lyra's world versus, I've forgotten the boy's name. Will, our world, like the contrast is so striking and so well done in the way they've designed the set design, the world design. And in a movie, it just didn't have that impact. It didn't have the same backwards and forwards. And Shadow and Bone's an interesting one too, because I found out afterwards that actually when they've made the TV show, they've essentially intercut separate books.
Interesting.
Because they're two separate, completely separate plots, completely away from each other, but they chose to basically put them all together.
Yeah.
So you didn't have to wait. If your favorite characters were in that half that came later, you didn't have to wait, because they are happening concurrently. I thought that was an interesting way of doing it.
It is. And now there's something to be said in terms of some of the characters in here without spoiling it. Oh gosh, how do I put this without spoiling it? But there's flashbacks in here to another time. And so that's just something that would be really awesome to see in an adaptation in which that's sort of interspersed with some of the characters. And so you could kind of get their there's a scene in which it's basically like a long flashback that is, it shows you, and the way Jen reacts to that, to experiencing that, which she had no idea about, she's sort of heartbroken by it. And she's like, oh my God, we lost so much when this all happened. She had no idea. She's used to her lunar punk night world, but she sees what was lost. And so there's a lot of story potential there. And, that we're talking about that off screen about stories, throughout that 500-year span. So it would be fun to do.
I really like the way you've described the 500-year span, because I like it when worlds feel real and as though they've developed and something happened and then something else happened. And I'm not a massive fan of the post-apocalyptic, as in it was all like that before, one single apocalypse happened and now it's all like that afterwards. I find them quite contrived and they don't really feel real, and it's harder to empathize. But the way you've described it, the slow, I can imagine that, and I'll find out soon, that when you can see how it's gone from us to there. It's still a real world. Yeah.
The flashbacks give you the opportunity to show you what was. It doesn't cover some of what happened in the in-between. It shows you the beginning of the end of our world, from a beautiful perspective, of showing how pretty, how good we actually do have it. Mm-hmm. What a freaking shame to blow it, right?
Yeah.
But also, it's a shame to absolve yourself of it, of any responsibility to help it. And I skewer people about that in this book. That people are like, oh, well, I'm not going to deal with that. I'm going to do something else because I want to preserve myself. Super selfish. But I see this in certain individuals in the world that, they want to come up with a way to skirt around it all without having to deal with it. And I don't like that. I feel like we have an opportunity to keep what's beautiful, beautiful, and so in this future, Jen doesn't know any differently. She doesn't know to regret that. This is just her world until something from our time splinters, that situation, and she's forced to deal with the ramifications of losing life as she knows it, and trying to understand what it was like in a time that wasn't that well preserved because of multiple disasters. It's never one disaster in 500 years. There's a lot, and your country knows that very well. So,
yes, we do. That's completely thrown me on what I was gonna.
Not that we don't know too, but your legacy is long.
Yeah, it is long. Yeah, absolutely. I do. I remember now. So that sounds to me a little bit like that part of it, the skewering, the being able to describe the world as it was and look at it in that beauty, that maybe comes from your time as a journalist and a science writer and bringing science facts into kind of a creative way. Do you think that?
Yeah, and it's interesting that the review I saw on FanFi Addict today talks about that, how I've basically woven in some science without it being preachy, because in everything I write, ecology is somehow there. I've given workshops, and I can't announce it yet, but I'm part of a pretty big workshop in the spring related to genre fiction, in which I teach people how to write thinking in terms of ecology and how we interact with the environment, whether it's in science fiction, fantasy, or horror, or some blend of those. So I give workshops on that. And that was this case too, where you have to come up with a world that makes sense, that seems real in your world building, no matter how extraordinary the circumstance or the location. And so in this case, I did that too. And having been a science writer as well, I knew quite a few facts because I do a lot of research on scientific papers, and I distill that knowledge into 1,000 words after all these pages of research. And it's just, I wanted to kind of get across, this is a plausibility situation. But, I also, though, there are fantasy elements. There is mysticism in this book. There is celebrated wonder on a level that science hasn't quite explained yet. So I have it all in there. There's something for everybody.
So Killish Andrews asked, and we did talk a little bit about young adult fiction having a teenage protagonist, but she's asked, do you feel that that's necessary to have the older teenage protagonist? But for you, how hard was it to find that younger voice?
Well, I should say that the main character is 14. Her cousin is about to turn 15. Her brother is 17, and there's 16 and plus some among her friends. Jen's one of the younger ones at 14, an older 14. Like you're just entering high school if you're in America, for example. So there are multiple teens of different ages, just so we're clear, but the main one is 14. So I feel like, gosh, I remember what it was like to be 14. So it wasn't hard for me. And I also have a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old. And I also was familiar with their friends and watching the dynamics of Gen Z trying to figure things out during this unprecedented past 4 years, which has wrecked so many things for them. But they're figuring it out, right? They've incorporated all of the things that have happened into their experience, and they're figuring it out, even though it is hard. So I feel like it wasn't hard for me to look far in myself or in that generation to figure out what's going on and how, and I never really planned to have this be a commentary on the pandemic, but in a lot of ways, I'm realizing it kind of is that, this kid is suddenly thrust into a situation beyond her control that's unraveling life as she knew it. And that wasn't an intention going in, but now that I'm thinking about it, that's very much what happened. So it's a Gen Z tome, by a Gen X mom.
And we're almost to the end of the stream, so let's have a question about the ending of things. So Kilishandra asks, young adult books tend to conclude on a hopeful or positive note. Do you agree this is needed, or do you feel there's space for alternative interpretations of young adult fiction?
Well, I'm rather biased because I write horror, and that does not always end in a rosy fashion. I love ambiguity. I love an unsettling ending for some of my stories. In this case, it's hope punk. Despite the dystopian stuff that interrupts the utopian life, there is a lot of hope. There is a lot of bravery that must be channeled. And I think that is a really good thing to offer teens. But I also think, let's not sugarcoat everything. You're becoming an adult and you've already been through things that maybe most adults never have to deal with, depending on who you are, and especially for the kids today who have been through this unprecedented situation right as they were entering puberty or whatever, and not being able to make the sort of connection socially or even in education, everything rapidly changing so that it's not what would have been. It wasn't what was for us, for example. And so I feel like we do need alternate interpretations that you can end on darker themes. I feel like I don't want to talk down to teens. I didn't like it or appreciate it when people did to me. And that's why I read much more adult things. And I know that, Stephen King understood that very well. He didn't try to sugarcoat anything. Why should I,
And I think like a lot of the good young adult fiction, like does have that. It does have a slightly darker,
Hunger Games. Yeah,
exactly. And like even what's really interesting. So I'm gonna actually give you a recommendation of a good young adult book called Boy in a White Room, by Karl Olsberg. It's a German book. I think it's the best-selling young adult book in Germany, and it's been translated into English. It's really interesting. It quotes René Descartes. It's a bit like The Matrix, but in a kind of young adult, deals with all those themes about what is real and what's not real. And I've been teaching that to my S3 class. So they're like 13, 14-year-olds.
Fantastic.
And then what's been fascinating is they absolutely loved it right up until the ending, and they universally hated the ending. Every single one of them. And I'm not going to spoil it because the ending is not what I expected. But it is interesting, and I think back to I in the past have taught The Giver by Lois Lowry, and again, kids tend to love that, but they don't like the ending. With Lowry, it's the ambiguity that they specifically don't like. They want to know what happens. With this one, in Boy in a White Room, you do find out exactly what happened, and that's what they don't like. And I thought it's interesting that the two extremes, extreme ambiguity and extreme clarity, both of them seem to turn them off.
Well, I have two books that a lot of Gen X Americans, I don't know if you guys read them because they seem very American to me, but two books that kind of scarred Gen X, Bridge to Terabithia and Where the Red Fern Grows. Like, oh my God. Like, we're listening to this being read to us by our teachers. We're like weeping, and we're like, oh my God, what? You know, and it just destroyed. They both destroyed us. Like on, you know, and they're, I guess you would consider them YA or almost like middle grade YA, kind of right in that teen, you know, young teen. And it just, they did not hold back, either of them. It was absolutely brutal. And even, but we all admitted, even though we hated that that's how it happened, we saw that it was beautiful and powerful, both of them. And we're like, well, we could change it and do fanfic where this was a different situation, but we understand that this was beautifully powerful the way it was done for both of those books. And I won't spoil them for anyone, but everybody should read both.
Yeah, it was Watership Down is what scarred me.
Oh my God.
Oh my God.
I was just about to say that, and Watership Down.
Yeah.
Totally. Well, even Wuthering Heights is,
I
mean, there is some positivity, but there's a lot of darkness in that.
I mean, actually, the thing that really scared me when I was a kid was Where the Wind Blows, which I don't think that made it across to America.
I know of it, but I didn't read it.
Yeah. No, it was a like an animated film. And it was made by, I think Raymond Briggs is his name, the guy who did like The Snowman and stuff like that. But it's about this elderly couple, and a nuclear war happens, and this elderly couple just slowly succumb to radiation poisoning over the course of it. Absolutely brutal. But of course, we all watched it because we're like, oh, the Snowman, Fungus the Bogeyman. That was gonna be really, and we're like, oh no. So it's absolutely.
It's kind of like The Last of Us, you know, game, and now a terrific show that so brutal, but so many generations, including Gen Z, are responding to The Last of Us. In you know, a visceral way, despite the darkness. So there's definitely space there for it, but you know, it's hard. But you know, this book definitely has a lot of hope, also plenty of darkness. So don't feel like you're only getting one and not the other, because there's both, you know. And then there's a lot of, without spoiling it, there's a whole lot that could be told in that universe.
And again, I've popped the link up and it's in the
Thank
comments.
you.
So please do go and check out Jendia's newest book, in At the Amethyst Lantern. And that brings us to the end of our stream today. So thank you so much again for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on the stream. I love hearing about your work. I love hearing about your inspiration. You're one of my absolute favorite authors in the world. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. You guys are the best, and I've always had a blast with you. So thanks for having me on again.
No, you're very welcome. And as always, thank you to everyone who showed up in the comments and the chat, who pre-submitted questions, and thank you to our Patreons who make the show possible. And until the next time, goodbye and good night and caw-caw, caw-caw, caw-caw. See you soon.